What's up guys, it's Eric from Rare Candy, and today we are counting down the top 5 worst cards from Celestial Storm. And in case you did miss it, we actually did post our top 10 favorite cards from the set, so if you guys want to see a slightly more optimistic video, I'll be sure to have a link to that one down below in the description. So for Celestial Storm, the set packs over 168 cards, which is great because that gives us a ton of new cards, but at the same time, with any set, there are bound to be some pretty terrible ones lumped in amongst all of the exciting cards we are getting, and that's what we're going to be focused on today. And before we get to the actual, let's just want to go over a few rules for this countdown. The first of which is that only Pokemon that are non-evolving or the final evolutions will be eligible for this list. So that means things like the new Metagross will be eligible for this list, but Beldum will not be. Just for the reason that if we were going to do the top 5 worst cards in the set, it would probably just be a bunch of 60 HP basics that do 10 damage for 1 energy. And, you know, that's just not a whole lot of fun to watch. And also, only reprints of cards that aren't already in the existing format are eligible for this list. That means things like the Rare Candy reprint that we got in the set won't be appearing on this list, but then other things like Acrobike or Bill's Maintenance, as an example, that are coming back into the format are eligible to appear on this list. So before we get to the actual top 5, there are a few ultra rares that I want to bring attention to in this set. Prism Stars and GXs won't be listed amongst the actual top 5 just because, let's face it, even the worst Prism Stars or the worst GXs are typically better than most of your average cards. So we're going to go over these separately. So the first of which is going to be Jirachi Prism Star coming in at the worst Prism Star in this set. This one was such a no-brainer for this particular set just because we only got 3 Prism Stars in total, with Jirachi being a great deal worse than the other 2 that we got. So Jirachi Prism Star has 80 HP, Fire Weakness, Psychic Resistance, a 1 retreat cost, has this ability Wish Upon a Star. If you took this Pokemon as a face-down prize card during your turn and your bench isn't full, before you put it into your hand, you may put it onto your bench and take 1 more prize card. And then it's Attack Perish Dream for 3 colorless energy, does 10 damage. This Pokemon is now asleep, and at the end of your opponent's next turn, the defending Pokemon will be knocked out. So if we just take a quick glance at Jirachi Prism Star, it has some interesting things going on for it, but some pretty bad things as well. The first of which is that it only has 80 HP. So Jirachi is by far and away one of the weaker Prism Stars that we've had printed, especially if you compare it to something like the Solgaleo Prism Star that we got out of Ultra Prism. That has 160 HP, and there's other Prism Stars that have a similar amount as well. So 80 is definitely going to be on the far lower side. But both the ability and the attack are just very awkward, and I think are going to be very inconsistent to actually pull off. So Wish Upon a Star is actually a really insane effect. Being able to grab an extra prize for free is crazy. But the problem is there's no way to consistently manipulate your prizes in a way that you will draw Jirachi Prism Star. So most of the time, if you are playing Jirachi Prism Star in your deck, you're only limited to 1 single copy because it is a Prism Star, which inherently will decrease your odds of actually getting it in your prizes. So most games, this card is just going to be floating around in your deck, and you'll never actually be able to use this ability. Now, having said that, there are some ways to manipulate your prizes. I think the one that's going to come to mind for most people is going to be Rotom Dex. So Rotom Dex is an item card we got all the way back in Sun and Moon, which will allow you to basically shuffle your prizes into your deck and then put out the same amount. But the problem is you have no control over what cards are actually going to go into your prizes. So this really isn't a consistent method of getting Jirachi in your prizes. And outside of that, we really don't have anything to work with. Now, I will say over in Japan, they do have an XY promo that actually can pretty effectively put Jirachi Prism Star in your prizes, but unfortunately that card was not printed outside of Japan, so the rest of the world has no real means of actually manipulating their prizes in a way where they can draw Jirachi. So the fact that we have nothing like that to ensure Jirachi is going to be in our prizes means we can't really make great use of this ability, so that only leaves us with this Attack Perish Dream. And the effect, don't get me wrong, is powerful. You know, if your opponent doesn't retreat or doesn't evolve or something like that, then they are knocked out, and that's pretty powerful. But the problem is all they have to do is retreat, and then the effect is cleared on that Pokemon. Or if they play a Guzma, that will remove them from the active spot or evolve. There's just so many ways to actually get around this thing, and it's unfortunate too because this attack makes Jirachi Prism Star go to sleep. It would make a lot more sense if it put your opponent's active Pokemon asleep instead, since that would kind of have synergy with the other effect of the card, making it more difficult for your opponent to get out of the active spot. But that's just not the case. You're putting yourself to sleep, only doing 10 damage for 3 energy as well. This attack is just so terrible. I can't emphasize that enough. Now, I will say this, maybe down the road, if there is a card that gets printed that helps manipulate Jirachi Prism Star to be put in your prizes, this card will see a lot more play. But for the moment, this card is just so bad and won't see any play without such a card. So next up, we are going to be looking at the worst Pokemon GX in the set, and that is going to be Mr. Mime GX. Now, I have to say, this admittedly was kind of a toss-up between Mr. Mime and Palossand GX, but I ultimately decided on Mr. Mime over Palossand, just because fighting does have some degree of support with things like Diancie Prism Star, Strong Energy, Regirock EX, even Focus Sash and Expanded, whereas Mr. Mime really just doesn't have that much going on for it. So Mr. Mime, the reason why this card has any, potential remotely is for this ability Magic Evens. So prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by your opponent's attacks. That is exactly 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120, 140, 160, 180, 200, 220, 240, or 260. So while at first glance this does make Mr. Mime look like a bit of a tank, there's just so many ways to actually get around this. So first of all, this Pokemon can still be hit by Pokemon that do damage in more odd amounts like 30, 50, etc., etc. But also, too, this is just such an easy ability to get around because of Choice Band. The fact that Choice Band boosts damage in an odd amount basically means that if your opponent is not already hitting for an odd amount of damage, they can do so by playing Choice Band on their attacker. So for example, if they are doing, let's say 80 damage and Mr. Mime would prevent that damage, they can just play a Choice Band and now they're hitting for 110 going through this ability. And the fact that Choice Band is in like almost every single deck really just does not bode well for Mr. Mime at all. Now, granted, there are things like Field Blower in the current format, and there's even Lysander Labs as a way of dealing with Choice Band, but a lot of decks will have a way to attack even without Choice Band, and even still, they can Field Blower things like Lysander Labs, and they typically play Choice Band in multiple quantities. And then even on top of that, we have to remember this is an ability, and there's various forms of ability lock. Of course, right now, before the rotation goes into effect, we have the Garbodor with that Garbotoxin ability, but then also we still have things like Alolan Muck, which will be running around in the post-rotation format. Then even expanded, we have things like Silent Lab as well. There's just so many different ways to actually get around this ability that I think makes it so that this will never actually be a viable card. Had there not been so many ways to get around this ability, this would be much, much stronger, but the fact that most decks can have a way to deal with this is just going to kind of set up Mr. Mime to really never be that great, especially when you consider the fact that its attack Breakdown and Life Trick GX are both very mediocre as well. Breakdown for a Psychic and Colorless does 1 damage counter for each card in your opponent's hand. And then its GX attack, Life Trick GX, for just a single Colorless, heal all damage from this Pokemon. So 2 very underwhelming attacks in conjunction with an ability that's very easy to play around. So that is why Mr. Mime GX is going to take the worst Pokemon GX title on this list. So next up, guys, we have our first official entry onto our top 5, and that is going to be Medicham. So Medicham is a new Stage 1 Pokemon, 90 HP, Psychic Weakness, 1 Retreat Cost, nothing, too crazy there, nothing too terrible, but let's take a look at its attacks. So the first of which is Strike of Enlightenment for 2 Fighting Energy, does 10, plus 160 more if this Pokemon's HP is 30 or less. So you might be thinking, well, man, this thing can do 170 damage. That's pretty crazy, right? Like, how could this possibly be on your top 5 worst cards in the set? And while that may be true, there is potential for Medicham to hit for large amounts of damage, and that is one reason why this card is actually at the number 5 spot and not higher. It's just very difficult to actually set this card up to be able to attack for this type of damage. So most things in the current format are just going to straight up knock out Medicham. You have to think most of the current decks in the format are taking 1-hit knockouts. And then we have 2-hit knockout decks like Zoroark GX, which hit for usually around 120. So the fact that the deck that is probably the weakest is doing 120 damage basically means you're never going to effectively be able to make use of this attack. Now, however, I will say this: with a Parallel City in play, Zoroark will only be hitting for 80 damage, but nevertheless, there are things like Field Blower to deal with that, and that's just such a situational type of instance where Medicham won't be knocked out somehow in one hit. So if the Pokemon in the current game are going to knock us out in one hit, we have to think, are there any ways to inflict damage upon ourselves to be able to make use of this effect? And there are a few. We do have things like Potown in play and Rainbow Energy, but both these cards aren't going to do enough damage to your Medicham to actually be able to make use of this attack. And then its other attack, Spinning Kick for 2 fighting, does 90 damage, and this Pokemon does 30 damage to itself. So you can see the card does have a little bit of synergy between the two attacks, but most of the time, like I said, Medicham's just getting knocked out. It's not really going to have a chance most of the time to actually make use of Strike of Enlightenment. So unless there's something that gets printed that really enables Medicham to be able to do this consistently, the card is just bad and probably won't ever see play. So next up, we have Lunatone coming in at the number 4 spot. And I do have to concede something, guys. This was actually originally my number 1 pick, but I decided to be a little bit more lenient on the card just because there are certain situations where this could be a decent tech card, maybe in the future, hypothetically. So let's take a look at Lunatone. Has 80 HP, has this ability Soul Shade. If you have Solrock in play, fire Pokemon in play, both yours and your opponent's, have no abilities except Pokemon GX and EX. And then its attack Psyshock for a single Psychic Energy is 10 and Paralysis on a coin flip. But from there, 80 HP, 1 retreat, Psychic Weakness, pretty standard stuff. So this card has such a weird design. So Soul Shade not only is very oddly specific, only targeting fire Pokemon, but even weirder than that, it's excluding GX and EX Pokemon, which are typically going to be, the more powerful Pokemon in the metagame that are worth shutting off a lot of the time. Then on top of that, you have to have a Solrock in play as well, which also makes this card more difficult to just slide into your deck as a tech. If its ability didn't require Solrock to be in play, this could have actually been maybe a consideration for certain decks going into the future, maybe depending on what gets printed. But the fact you need Solrock in play and it excludes GX and EX Pokemon is just really weird, and the attack is just completely terrible. This is absolutely worthless attack. There's no real reason to ever try to use Psyshock. But I will say this, the reason why this is at number 4 instead of number 1, which is originally where I had this at, is because there are actually a few decent non-GX EX abilities that are worth shutting off. The first of which is Magcargo, which we also got in Celestial Storm. Very, very powerful ability in the form of Smooth Over. A lot of Zoroark decks look to be able to make use of that, but the problem is I don't see anyone dedicating 2 spots in their deck to shut off Smooth Over. Smooth Over just kind of enhances an existing strategy. It's not really... if you shut off someone's Magcargo if they're playing Zoroark, their deck still runs pretty normally. Magcargo just enhances their existing strategy. So most of the time, no player would really ever want to tech in a Lunatone and Solrock in their deck just to shut off something that is a 1-1 or a 2-2 in a deck that isn't central to the deck's strategy to function. But having said that, there is a new Blaziken on the horizon that actually got excluded from Celestial Storm. Right now, it does look to be most likely coming in Dragon Majesty. It's not confirmed at the time of filming, but that is another Pokemon that has a strong ability, and it is a non-GX. So maybe down the road, if Blaziken does emerge to be a very, very powerful deck in the metagame, and your deck is struggling to deal with that, then Solrock and Lunatone can be decent techs to include, maybe to shut down that deck. I do think that is a potential option. Now granted, I don't know how likely that is actually to happen, but nevertheless, for that reason, guys, I did downgrade this to the number 4 spot, but overall, the ability is just way too situational, and the attack is completely terrible. Now, I will mention, too, there is a Solrock in the set that will increase your Lunatone's HP a bit, but even outside of that, it doesn't really do anything to make this card less terrible. Like, yeah, that's great. You have more HP on a still terrible card. So, yeah, guys, just not too excited about this Lunatone. That's why it's coming in at the number 4 spot. Next up, at number 3, we have a new Deoxys. It actually kind of pains me to say that Deoxys is on this list because we actually did get a pretty good Deoxys in this set as well, but I guess they had to make a pretty bad one to even things out. So this Deoxys has 100 HP, 1 retreat cost, psychic weakness, pretty standard stuff here. 100 HP, half decent on a basic, I will at least admit. But its first attack, teleportation burst for a single psychic energy does 20, and you may switch this Pokemon with one of your bench Pokemon. And then its other attack, spear dive for 3 colorless energy does 50 to one of your opponent's Pokemon, but it isn't affected by weakness or resistance. So overall, guys, this card, it's pretty straightforward, but it's just a very mediocre card in basically every sense of the word. Teleportation Burst just does not hit enough, and there's not really a great damage modifier for Psychic Pokemon. If we had something akin to Strong Energy or Latias Prism Star to modify this damage, I think this Deoxys actually wouldn't be that terrible, but the fact that you're only going to be hitting 20 against a lot of things is very annoying. It's just not enough to make this an actual viable strategy to build a deck around. And similarly, Spear Dive, pretty terrible. 3 energy for 50 is laughably bad. Think of something like Zoroark GX can do 120 or 150 with Choice Band for just a single energy attachment. You're telling me I'm only going to do 50. Now granted, I do get to choose if I want to hit a Pokemon on the bench or the active, but it's also not affected by weakness, so I can't even hit a Buzzwole for 100 damage. And then with 50 damage, you're a little bit shy of actually knocking out like low HP evolving basics, so I can't even knock out something like a Ralts or an Alolan Vulpix or something like that. This card is just so underwhelming in every sense of the word. It's just the damage to energy ratio for Spear Dive is laughably bad. In Teleportation Burst, like I said, it really wouldn't be a terrible attack had we had some damage modifiers, because we've seen things like Donphan all the way back from Plasma Storm see a lot of success for a similar type of attack. But one reason that deck was good was because Fighting had a lot of damage modifiers like Strong Energy, like Fighting Stadium at the time, etc., etc. Teleportation Burst just doesn't have anything like that. Had we had aggressive aggro psychic engine to increase our damage, we could play things like Hoopa, Xurkitree GX, or maybe some other wall Pokemon to potentially throw forward after we use Teleportation Burst, but we just don't have anything to actually make that happen. So unfortunately, guys, this card has basically zero potential unless they print some sort of crazy psychic type damage modifying Pokemon or cards in some way. Coming in at number 2, we have Pelipper, another weird form of fire hate that we have on this list. I don't know what it is about these bad cards in this set hating fire Pokemon, but we have yet another one. So this is actually a colorless Pelipper, which is kind of interesting. Most of them have been water type, but it says a stage 1, 120 HP, lightning weakness, fighting resistance, 2 retreat cost. I will actually admit the weakness and resistance are both actually really nice, but let's take a look at its attacks. Its first of which is firefighting for a single colorless energy, does 30, and you discard a fire energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. And then its other attack, water pulse, for 3 colorless energy is 80, and your opponent's active is now asleep. So very similar to the Deoxys we just looked at, the damage to energy ratio for both these attacks just isn't that great. Firefighting doing 30 for 1 is actually not bad if this were maybe a basic Pokemon. Things like Buzzwole GX and the Baby Buzzwole see play partially because they can do a lot of damage very quickly without having to wait multiple turns to get evolutions out, like in the case of Pelipper, just as an example. And also in that particular instance, fighting has a lot of different support to increase its damage, but with firefighting, we're basically going to be capped at 30 damage or 60 if we have a choice band attacking into a GX or EX. But the secondary effect of this is just so oddly specific. Discard a fire energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. Well, unfortunately, fire is just not a very popular type right now. And in the case of the fire Pokemon that do see some fringe play, like Volcanion style decks, they usually have plenty of ways at retrieving fire energy via energy retrieval or the baby Volcanion. So a lot of times this attack actually isn't even that great at dealing with fire decks if your deck does seem to struggle with fire decks. And similarly, Water Pulse for 3 to do 80 is just really mediocre. The upside to this attack, you can use double colorless energy, so 2 attachments to do 80 isn't the absolute worst, but when you compare that to other Pokemon that are in the format, it's just very underwhelming. Asleep, also not one of the stronger status conditions either. Half the time your opponent's just going to wake up right away. And then being colorless, you can't hit anything for weakness either to modify this damage a whole lot. So overall, the card is just really underwhelming. Now, I will say one positive thing to firefighting is that you can actually discard things like Rainbow Energy or maybe Unit Energies, some of these special energies that do provide fire in some way. So that is one upside to this, but I think if you're trying to deal with a popular deck that plays Rainbow Energy, most of the time you're just going to be better off playing something like an Enhanced Hammer or Crushing Hammers or something like that. And also, I'm going to try to give Pelipper a little credit. There are some exciting fire Pokemon that look to have some potential in the future. Most notably, Blaziken GX that came out in the set looks to get a little bit better once the baby Blaziken mentioned earlier in this video comes out, and also once Magcargo GX comes out. I think these are both cards that potentially might be popular once they come out. But even still, these are going to be decks that have ways to retrieve fire energy anyways, so playing a stage 1 to deal with these fire decks is just a really bad means of improving your matchup against them. If your deck does struggle against some of these fire decks, I promise you there is a better way to deal with them than playing this card. It's just highly situational. It doesn't hit anything for weakness. It's just not that strong in general, and it's just a bad way at dealing with fire attackers. That's why Pelipper is going to be at the number 2 spot. And coming in at the number 1 spot on this list, we have our first and only trainer card, and that is going to be Bill's Maintenance. So Bill's Maintenance actually is a card from way back in the day making its return, and it's a supporter card. You shuffle a card from your hand into your deck. If you do, draw 3 cards. And what's interesting is that Bill Maintenance actually has seen play a long time ago in the past, but in this day and age, this card is just not that great. I'd say even back then the card wasn't spectacular, but especially in today's day and age, we have vastly superior draw options at our disposal. And we actually have a few other cards that have a draw 3 style effect, and they just easily eclipse Bill's Maintenance. So in the case of Howl that we've had in the format for a while, and similarly Tierno and Charon, which all do the same thing, we have just a straight draw 3 effect already, and we don't have to shuffle in anything from our hand into our deck. So there's literally no reason to ever play Bill's Maintenance over these other cards that have this draw 3 effect. Similarly, we also got TV Reporter back in the format with Celestial Storm as well, and TV Reporter has us discard a card, but it's after we draw the 3. So with Bill's Maintenance, we're actually netting kind of 2 cards in a way, not really 3, because we're having to put a card from our hand back into our deck. And also, unlike something like Howl or TV Reporter, we can't play Bill's Maintenance with a 0-card hand either. So like I mentioned, we're only really netting 2 cards, and then when we start comparing that to some of the other draw 2 options that we have, like Professor Kukui, just as an example, that's just another reason to never play this card. Similarly, we still have, let's also talk about some of the great draw supporters that we have. We have Cynthia, we have Sycamore, we have N for the time being, we have Lily even. There's just so many other cards that easily eclipse this. Bill's Maintenance is just so completely and utterly outclassed by everything that we have at our disposal. Even post-rotation, once we lose things like Sycamore and N, we just have so many better ways to actually draw cards. And whether it's a draw 2 effect or a draw 3 effect, Bill's Maintenance does not trump any of the existing ones that we're going to have pre or post-rotation. That's why Bill's Maintenance is going to be taking the number 1 spot as our worst card from Celestial Storm. But of course, guys, this list is completely subjective. Definitely sound off below in the comment section. What do you guys think? Do you think I rated anything a little too harshly or not harsh enough? Or maybe you think I missed something entirely? Definitely sound off below in the comment section. Let us know what you think about this list. And of course, like I mentioned earlier too, definitely check out our top 10 best cards of Celestial Storm as well. But as usual, guys, feel free to like and subscribe, and if you can support this channel by becoming a patron over at patreon.com/rarecandytcg, or by picking up something from our online store at rarecandytcg.com, it would mean a lot. But with that, I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you next time.